Can you think of any reason why they would have pulled the plug at the last minute?
Well, a couple of reasons. Some of what Ambassador Sondland has to say is clearly not helpful to the administration. And so I can imagine they made a calculated decision. Better to obstruct the proceedings and preclude him from testifying than let him tell the story. However, Stephanie, some of that story is already told, not just by the whistleblower, but also by other people who were party to the conversation and by the text messages themselves. So please don't think that there's no evidence of what happened. In fact, quite to the contrary, there's pretty good evidence of what happened.
Josh, they might not want Sondland to tell his story, but how can they technically have the right to do something like this, especially if a similar diplomat, i.e. Volker, testified last week? What grounds?
I don't think there are lawful grounds. This resistance is a direct assault on congressional oversight, which is crucial to our constitutional checks and balances. You know, I'm honored to be part of the team that's representing the House already in a lawsuit against Trump's former White House counsel, Don McGahn, who was served with a congressional subpoena, got a letter from the president saying don't show up, and didn't show up. That's not the way it's supposed to work. The courts have rejected that in the past, such as in Harriet Meyer's case. The courts should reject that here as well.
Robert, here's what I don't get. Sondland could have been the one person to help tell the Trump side of the story. He's not a career diplomat. This is a $1 million Trump donor, a hotel magnate who, by the way, representing the EU, which Ukraine is not part of, had no business being in this conversation. He could have been the one, many people thought, who would have been the Corey Lewandowski of witnesses who would have thrown a monkey wrench in it.
There was an apprehension inside of the White House in recent days that Ambassador Sondland would not be like Mr. Lewandowski in the sense that he is a Trump supporter, but he's not a political operative and he's not a loyalist. He wants to protect his reputation, his own career, his business interests moving forward when he's not an ambassador. And so you have an administration dealing with someone they know is an ally, but someone who they can't necessarily count upon to toe the line. And he had shown eagerness to testify on Capitol Hill.
So hold on, just say this one more time, because I think this is extraordinary. He showed eagerness, but many people falsely assumed eagerness like a Corey Lewandowski saying, sure, I'll show up. He was there to show up and perform for a party of one, i.e. the president. The risk you're saying that you've heard inside the White House is that Sondland, while a Trump employee, wasn't red, white, and blue, all Trump all the time.
Well, because he was a federal employee, not a political employee, and you have someone in Ambassador Sondland who may have felt like, according to his own associates in the Post reporting, that he was swept up in Mayor Giuliani's activities and discussions with Ukrainian officials, and that as the ambassador to the European Union, he was uncomfortable, perhaps, with some of these activities, and that came across in various text messages we saw, and he was, if not implicated, at least involved and familiar with some of these discussions, and his lawyer said this morning he still wants to testify. So it's the White House and this administration looking to try to block him from doing so.
Chuck, if Sondland resigns, like Kurt Volker did, would he then be free to testify and not be blocked by the State Department or the White House?
Yeah, as a current employee, it's much easier for the State Department and the administration to block him. If he resigns, it gives him a bit more liberty and a bit more leeway, Stephanie. But the White House could still invoke executive privilege. And I'm not sure it would succeed in the end if that were litigated. But Sondland and his lawyer might decide, it wouldn't be an irrational choice, that they would abide by that invocation and let a court decide. That's the box that a lot of people find themselves in. If the White House makes an invocation of executive privilege, it says, Stephanie, you can't go and testify. Are you going to decide on your own that you can, or are you going to prefer to let a court resolve that for you?
Josh, do you anticipate that the White House or the State Department could block the ex-ambassador as well? President Trump relieved her of her duties. He had said he heard bad things about her. So I'm guessing she'd like to go and tell her story. She's expected to speak later this week. Do you think that's going to change?
Well, it was President Trump himself who said at one point, we're resisting all the subpoenas, or something to that effect. And of course, that seems to have meant more broadly, we're resisting all congressional attempts at oversight, at understanding the full scope of what happened here. But my hope would be that this plays out the way it played out for Kurt Volker, in that he wanted to testify, he added meaningfully to Congress's and frankly the public's understanding of what happened, and it seems that our former ambassador could add a lot this Friday.
Robert, what is the official White House line? If they let Kurt Volker speak to investigators, they let the DNI and the intelligence community IG testify, what is their official argument as to why Sondland can't?
At this point, we're still trying to report that out. You have a White House that doesn't have a clear, concise strategy when it comes to dealing with Congress. At times, they let officials testify. Other times, they're engaged in political and legal warfare against the House of Representatives over executive power. And this is a showdown that's not going to end anytime soon. But this is a White House that's reacting more than strategizing. Based on my conversations with top Republicans, they're not sure day in, day out what exactly this White House will do, but they know they're trying to preserve documents and witnesses as much as possible.
All right, Charles, then in terms of this being a fight that's not going to end anytime soon, what do Democrats do now, technically? When we see subpoenas blocked or ignored or witnesses not really show up or speak, we hear, well, we're going to take this to the courts. And then it kind of slides into the ether. Technically, what happens next?
Right. Well, there are things that they can do, right? There are people who do want to testify. There are documents that they've already obtained.
But
and by the way,
Sondland says he wants to testify.
Right, and maybe he'll get a chance to. But as I mentioned earlier, Stephanie, there's a lot of other evidence that already exists. I mean, it seems like years ago that the Mueller report came out. Volume 2 of the Mueller report outlines 10 instances of obstruction of justice. I mean, that's all there for the Democrats if they want to use it. And I'm not quite sure I understand why they don't.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.